sound somewhat conspiratorial when I try to put this forwards, but that's genuinely not my intention. But you have to wonder to yourself, as this is twice now that an event has happened and the ripple effects appear to be premeditated. First, we had George Floyd, immediately followed by worldwide protests, demands for representation in Parliament, as well as elsewhere, and finally the justification that so many needed to begin their implementation of so-called anti-racism. And then we have the event that transpired in Glasgow. A bulk of the Scottish media has already jumped on the poor refugee narrative, and surprise, surprise, there's now calls for justice, there's calls for change. And when you know, we're talking about this previous to the Glasgow incidents. Now, I'm not saying that they faked the events. What I am saying, however, is that there is method in their madness when it comes to them blatantly twisting the narrative in order to suit their agenda, to meet their own ends. I mean, a man seemingly runs around with a knife, killing folk and injuring others, and the response is that more needs to be done for the plight of asylum seekers. I mean, I wasn't exactly expecting, or I wouldn't expect to see, anybody from the government coming out and saying anything negative in relation to asylum seekers and their so-called plight. But to come out and completely 180 the narrative, to try and make you feel sorry for asylum seekers, despite the fact an asylum seeker seemingly went on a rampage. Bit random, don't you think? Clown world, as they say. But lo and behold, they were talking about change, action, justice, weeks before the event took place. Now granted, the refugee plight is never out of the media in Scotland, but it really has picked up the pace in recent weeks before the Glasgow event. But a lot more now. I've got a rake of articles opened up here, and there's even some survey shows desire for new approach to refugee protection in Scotland. This is the 19th of June. A new poll shows the majority of people in Scotland support major changes to the way the UK asylum system is run. The survey carried out by Survation in June 2020 found that 73% of Scots think people seeking asylum should be allowed to work to support themselves and their families. You know, is there anywhere else in the world where asylum seekers are able to work? 52% think people seeking asylum should receive financial support in line with current rates of universal credit. Of course, more reason to entice more over here. I mean, anywhere in Europe that they could possibly dream of. Let's go to Rainbow Unicorn Land, where they can work if they so choose. They'll get the red carpet. And they'll get benefits for fucking nothing. 59% believe it would be better for Scotland to run its own asylum and immigration system. That is the most cancerous and most dangerous conceivable idea that I've heard in a long time. Giving that power to the SNP, or even just the Scottish Government for that matter, would be the death of Scotland. 74% believe it's important to make refugees feel welcome in Scotland. The UK currently bans people from working to support themselves and their families before they receive a positive decision on their claim for protection. You've opened the door to people from all over the world to come here and claim asylum, or try to anyway, under the Syrian resettlement scheme. You know, the Syrian resettlement scheme that came about, go figure, for the war in Syria. And then, obviously, when they buried the rape gang in Glasgow, all the asylum seekers, where did they all come from? Well, let's see what the Syrian resettlement scheme managed to bring to us to enrich our society. You know, it says down here, all were asylum seekers from Kurdish, Afghani, Egyptian, Moroccan, Turkish, Pakistani and Iraqi communities. Well, let's not forget we've got Somalians and Sudanese, etc. And we've got people from other African countries that aren't even going through what would be considered a war. You know, but the Syrian resettlement scheme, open brackets, the rest of the world. You don't, these people are trying their damnedest to make it as easy as possible for more and more people to come here. People are forbidden to work. They must live in asylum support of around £5 per person per day. Plus they get free accommodation, free water, free electricity, etc. They've got everything catered for. So don't sit there and try to wield out the £5 argument as if they're so hard done by. They're living in a house or accommodation for free, getting everything given to them for free at the taxpayer's expense. A small majority of Scottish residents surveyed think that this amount is too low and the rate should be increased. So that's great. Let's give more of our money to people that shouldn't be here. With asylum policy decided on by the government in Westminster, the survey asked whether it would be better for Scotland to manage its own asylum system, and 59% of respondents agreed that this would be better than the current arrangement. The current arrangement, of course. Let's not forget here that has seen Scotland welcome twice the UK average of Syrian quote-unquote refugees. So Scotland's not even in charge of the refugee policy, but yet more have still come to Scotland, in theory. I know a lot of them have supposedly left and gone to England as the years have gone on, but the point remains the same. Thin lips open her arm to a bunch of Syrians at the time, hypothetical Syrians. And then she quietly let in another bulk. Didn't tell the public she was going to do that until after the fact. And especially this year and late last year, there's been a serious increase in the amount of Africans that are in this country. There's been a serious increase in the amount of people that are failed asylum seekers that should be gone but are still here. Now, what's going on there? And why is there no media coverage of it? Why is there nothing that can be found in relation to why there's been an increase, an uptick in the amount of these people here? We also found that almost 3/4 of Scottish residents believe it's important to make refugees feel welcome in Scotland. That's great. And it's also open to interpretation. What does that mean exactly? Because it's one thing to say that you don't mind refugees, one thing to say, to save face that refugees are welcome here or whatever it may be. But unless you're bending over backwards for them and bootlicking, I don't really think these people will ever feel welcome. And that's if we take the narrative at face value here. They're so oppressed, they're so self-entitled, etc. We are in a time of seismic change, all premeditated, of course. And this poll shows... People in Rainbow Unicorn Land are ready for a more fair and humane approach to refugee protection. I mean, what is this shit? I'm going to bite my tongue on that front. Bore anybody with going through all these articles that have come across, that have all come out in Alaska to asylum seekers and their harrowing plights. But there's a few things around these articles that I do think needs to be touched upon very briefly. As for example, it says here that the CRC released a statement following the incident, saying it had expressed repeated concern over the last 3 months about the use of hotel accommodation for people in asylum. These are people who have lost their homes and livelihoods and are now desperate for a new start, but otherwise are no different from the rest of us in Glasgow. It's always been our belief that people who are in Scotland seeking refugee protection deserve safe, secure accommodation, a home from which to rebuild their lives. Temporary accommodation can never fix this. Of course. We await a full investigation into the background and culmination of Friday's attack and condemn the attempts to use this incident to further incite racism and fear, but it was okay for you all to use George Floyd's to incite racial tension and start your bollocks about BLM, Like, for example, this is back on the Refugee Council's website. They had an article that came out in relation to the demonstrations that took place the other week. Our statement of Glasgow's demonstrations. The small demonstration was initially organised by people who had been living in hotel accommodation during COVID-19 to protest their condition, lack of any money, and the recent death of their friend, Adnan Obe. Their voices will now be lost in the noise. Let's be blunt, those spreading hate care far more about intimidation and violence than engaging with the actual issues of those who are desperately struggling to get by right now. Everybody's desperately struggling to get by right now. I don't really understand why we need to prioritise fucking refugees. But secondly, it's funny how these people come out hot on the heels of BLM. What were you expecting? People were there to protect statues. So if a bunch of so-called after a week of BLM threats and BLM marches, etc., all across the UK, the announcement comes out that there's going to be a pro-refugee march. Stands to reason it sounds rather similar, don't you think? That's why they were met with what you consider force. Glasgow, Scotland, we say we are a welcoming city and nation. We cannot allow this hatred, racism and thuggery to seep into our streets. I mean, it's just unbelievable how the politicians, all the media, etc., they're all in on the same shit. There's one-sided, skewed version of events. And it's funny because all these groups that they pander to still parrot the lie that they're all oppressed and marginalised, etc., despite the fact all the politicians and the media cover for them relentlessly. The demand of those in the hotel remains the same. An improvement to the living conditions, reinstatement of financial support, and an immediate return to safe, own-door housing. We urge people in Glasgow and further afield to unite in showing support and solidarity with all those recovering from this awful episode and organise against the government's policies that have created these circumstances. Before he carried out his attack. The Positive Action and Housing Director, Rabina Qureshi, said, "We didn't know the full extent until the last few days. The fact that people didn't have access to water. They were drinking tap water from the toilets. That people were terrified of breathing air. They talked about the presence of dirty air conditioning and the virus transmitting through it, and windows not opening so there was no clean air. I find some of that very difficult to believe, bar the window part, in a pretty swanky hotel. All things considered, it's not the worst hotel in the world when you look at it on the internet. Toilet bowls, fuck off, man. And they were talking about no social distancing in the hotel. This is the level of mental pressure they were under when they could quite easily go out. Public sector maintenance contractor Mears took over the contract to house asylum seekers in Glasgow following controversy about its predecessor. Serco had embarked on a campaign of changing locks on flats, rightfully so, occupied by failed asylum seekers whose leave to remain in the UK had been refused, and subsequently by extension, they refused to leave the property. A spokesman for Mears said it was providing access to additional counselling support and to essential items such as clothing. That's cute. And then we've got this one. Anti-racism group to hold Glasgow protest against dreadful condition for asylum seekers. The protest will take place outside the Home Office on Brown Street between 6 and 7. Isn't that something? In a statement, the anti-racism group, go figure, wrote, throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, asylum seekers and asylum rights activists, charities and others in civic Scotland have been warning about the dreadful conditions faced by asylum seekers who were forced to move, often at no more than a half hour's notice, from their settled homes and into adequate hotel accommodation. They keep trying to paint this little narrative here that they were all sitting there having their, their Christmas dinner type shit. They're all settled in nicely. Half of these people are failed asylum seekers. Are we just going to pretend that that isn't a fact at this point? These are people that continuously file for new claims, despite the fact it's being rejected. Anyway. Yes, the statement continued that many asylum seekers are living, here we go again, with these baseless assumptions. You keep slapping labels on these people without them having to prove whether or not it's the case. Of course, they're going to play that to the assumptions you've placed upon them. You don't know that they're living with trauma or long-term mental health issues associated with their harrowing life experiences. So they just need to say that that's the case. For all you know, though, some guys come over here from Chad or wherever it is in Africa. Quite the thing, but he just pretends that he came from a war-torn area of Africa. Transferring them to isolated hotel rooms beside strangers without suitable vulnerability checks by either Mears or the Home Office was always a terrible idea. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but I really don't understand what the fuck that's got to do with a man running around stabbing people. There was an overwhelming response to the call by charity Positive Action Housing and others for donations of clothing, etc, etc. Anyway, it brings me to this. This came out, it's the 3rd now, so 2 days ago. Refugees for Justice has said asylum seekers have been placed in inhumane and undignified conditions with very limited access to supports, and call for a safe, transparent, supportive asylum system. Well. Seems that we have gone full circle, does it not? A refugee support organisation has called for an end to a broken, inhumane and unjust asylum and immigration system in the wake of the Parkin stabbing, of course. Refugees for Justice has released a manifesto calling for a safe, transparent, supportive and publicly accountable process, yada yada. The incident on Friday led to 6 people being attacked, including police officer David White, and supposedly several dead. 3 dead, no? Why did they never include that? The Mears group is currently using the hotels as housing for asylum seekers during the coronavirus pandemic, quote unquote. Refugees for Justice, which is launched today, have described the incident as a devastating tragedy, adding people come to Scotland for peace and sanctuary, not for violence. Is that what they tell you? The organisation said asylum seekers were put in inhumane and undignified conditions. Well, you would fucking say that because you've been one of them, presumably, or your group being members of this so-called community that's oppressed. It's me off another group called More, I think they're called. And they're based on trying to get equal rights, etc. for asylum seekers and whatnot. In fact, I pull up their 10 goals, if you will. So it's hard to tell because they're writing shit, but the gist of it is that support equal access to higher and further, presumably, education, aid and support integration into communities, support decent, secure and affordable, presumably, homes, where support equal rights to work. Why should refugees and asylum seekers get the right to work? Migrants have the right to work, so we're talking about asylum seekers and refugees here. They don't specify, but that's what it means. To end deportations and removal. So we have a bunch of Africans that will come over here to claim asylum, probably wrongly, or rightly, but probably wrongly. And the first thing, or one of the first things they do when they arrive here, is to prevent other people from being deported. I mean, what is this? Work to allow application for asylum from outside the UK, I think that says. Work to end police intervention in asylum issues. Work to eventually not need to exist as a group. Oh, please. Support equal access to services and funding, I think. Fight to remove private interest in asylum issues. Fight to remove private interest in asylum issues. So the reason I bring this up is this is just one example of a politicized group of, or politically minded group of migrants and refugees, etc. And it's really no different to what's going on just now, Carl, about yet. And they've come out with a manifesto. I mean, you know things are bad in Scotland in terms of cuckery when it comes to refugees conjuring up little manifestos with their demands. Deserve this. We do not deserve this. The city does not deserve this. None of the victims of this devastating tragedy deserve this. Staff members of the Park Inn Hotel did not sign up to be detention workers or psychotherapists working with people who are fleeing persecution. Right off the bat, incorrect. So we're straight away planting assumptions on these people. Just because somebody comes to this country and applies for asylum does not mean, by default, that they are fleeing persecution or war or whatever it may be. It's a cop-out, essentially. And realistically, just giving them that option to claim that that's what they're fleeing, just assuming that right off the bat without having to get them to prove that that's actually the case, opens the door to more. And that's kind of my point when it comes to these people. They are trying their damnedest to make it as easy as possible for more and more to join them. And these assumptions and these labels that get slapped onto them, that they're all by default vulnerable. They're all by default fleeing persecution because they wouldn't dare try to apply for asylum wrongfully. Of course not. No. Of course not. How did this tragedy happen? What was the underlying cause of this devastating tragedy? We believe a broken, inhumane and unjust asylum and immigration system that allows people to be treated this way and allows our cities, communities and citizens to face such tragic consequences. Also, it's the system's fault. It is the system's fault for why a man allegedly stopped up a hotel. I'm still questioning why there was videos of another man being arrested, and apparently there was 2 men that got arrested. Why are they not getting a mention? There's something fishy about this, but the point remains the same. If we take the narrative at face value, how the fuck does a man being treated what you classify as inhumane, what, because he couldn't get good Wi-Fi, or he didn't like the dinner at the hotel, all paid for by the taxpayer of course, he decided don't stab up the place? It's the system's fault, is it? I mean, are you having a laugh here? You know, I thought it was bad enough when we had the SNP, or in particular Alison Thulis, a rainbow unicorn feminist. She came out the other day to talk about the need for these people to be given their own accommodation. You know, she completely twisted the narrative from what was supposed to have taken place to conjure up sympathy for the refugees in these hotels. You know, it's nonsensical. We move people from individual safe, shared houses and flats to hotel rooms. From spaces where physical distancing in households could be maintained to spaces where they could not. How could this be justified and compliant with public health instructions when everyone else in Scotland was told to stay home in separate households? A hotel is not a detention centre or private provision. Why was this change made? And what was the company profit in removing all maintenance payments? We have heard some previous answers to these questions from Mears. Yes, I've got multiple articles up here. And quite often you'll get the activists on one side and then Mears coming out with a relatively normal response. Whether or not they are telling the truth is a different matter entirely. But if I had to guess, some of the outlandish, bogus claims that seem to get made quite often from the lefty activist side, I'm more inclined to take Mears' side for some of it anyway. Anyhow, but we know they are not true. Oh, they know it's not true. How do they know this, I wonder? We know because we have heard and seen the truth daily, directly from our friends, our fellow asylum seekers and refugees in those hotel rooms. Okay, so anecdotal evidence, okay. We have been trying consistently to raise their concerns with the authorities in the Mears Group. We protect the residents of City Glasgow, and that is why on Wednesday the 17th of June we went to George Square to protest and to tell the truth to the public. On that day in George Square, we were violently attacked. We were... What? We were not listened to. Following the move, asylum seekers were neglected. They were put in inhumane and undignified conditions. What do you mean inhumane? They were put into hotel rooms with TV, everything paid for, and they could leave when they want. According to Mears anyway. So what are you talking about? Inhumane. You know? It's just ridiculous. On the one hand, I want to call them self-entitled, but on the other hand, there is a part of me that thinks that this is no different to the climate gurus, the NGOs and whatnot, that seem to do a lot of the talking on the Scottish Government's behalf. Anyway, they were distressed, isolated and neglected and were not able to protect themselves. Their mental health deteriorated significantly. You think, you presume, possibly some, but the same could be said for everybody in Scotland. quite easily. There's a multitude of people out there that live alone, multitude of people out there that have disabilities and whatnot that need the outside, etc. What about the people in the sparse areas of the Highlands? This can't have been good for them. What about old people? But no, it's about immigrants and refugees and the inhumane conditions in fucking hotels. Adnan, a 30-year-old Syrian refugee, died in one of the hotel rooms earlier in May. It is reported that his mental health rapidly deteriorated after being moved from his home to a hotel room. A Scottish investigation is ongoing, and we respect that it will take some time for the full facts to emerge. We believe he could still be alive if he was not put in such distressing conditions, and if he could have access to adequate support. Well, you don't know that for a fact, but you're still included in here anyway. Badreddin, a 28-year-old man who was here seeking asylum, was shot dead by police after he stabbed 6 people in the Parkin Hotel. Now, what part of Syria was Baredan or Redin? He wasn't from Syria, was he? And that's why you didn't include that he was from Syria. You just said that he was seeking asylum. Again, wrongfully. He was neglected, humiliated and isolated, and that justifies him running around stabbing people. He was distressed the night before the incident. Oh, well, I've been in that boat. Been tempted myself to stab up the place. He expressed his anger and frustration to other asylum seekers in the hotel, and this was reported to hotel staff. We believe he could still be alive and this devastating tragedy could have been prevented. We have hundreds of devastating stories and shocking testimonies which we demand to be heard. We are presenting you with the simple facts coming directly from asylum seekers and refugees who we speak to, who have been trapped in those hotel rooms for months now. We ask that they can leave, by the way. They can't go back to where they were previously, but they can quite easily leave for the day or for an hour or whatever it is. They're trying to make out that these people are locked in their rooms. They're not. It's bollocks. We ask for those stories to be fully heard. We ask for a safe, transparent and supportive and publicly accountable process to be put in place for people to talk about their experience free from any fear of intimidation. This includes all staff members, etc. In the past 3 months, asylum seekers have been constantly silenced, intimidated and threatened. I mean, just pull the other one. Pull the other one. The media do nothing but pander to the likes of yourself. Another group that class themselves as oppressed, yet they've got the media's backing. Isn't that something? People who seek asylum do not feel safe to speak out because they fear that it would affect their asylum claim. Well, it hasn't stopped you lot, has it? Don't hand me that one. How many asylum seekers are still here months, if not years, after they've had their initial claim rejected? You know, the Scottish government in particular, but the UK as a whole, don't do a hell of a lot when it comes to deporting people. You know it's a free-for-all. That's why you came here. We ask for specific steps to be taken and additional support to be put in place to ensure that people who seek asylum are empowered to talk about their experiences in an open and honest way without reprisal. So again, this is what's strange to me. Who in their right mind that's desperate to leave their country because of war and persecution, etc., thinks to themselves, I know what I'm going to do now that I've arrived in this safe country that's opened its arms and graciously let me in. I'm going to campaign. I'm going to become a social justice activist. Or is it more safe to assume that these individuals before they arrived here were already social justice activists that have seen an easy inlet to Scotland and they've made it their fucking home? We all have first-hand experience of how people who seek asylum in the UK are routinely denied their basic rights. We have serious concerns that the rights and humanity of people who seek asylum will be further denied in the process of understanding what went wrong and holding the people who were responsible to account. I mean, what are you talking about? A guy stabs up a hotel and you're blaming the system. The person responsible for what happened in that hotel has been shot dead, allegedly. We demand. It's great. Those responsible for the inhumane treatment of people who seek asylum and the policies and decisions that have contributed to the deaths and irreparable harm to the lives of our fellow classmates to be able to account our fucking... Oh, I'm saying nothing. Additional steps to be taken and specific support to be put in place to ensure that people who seek asylum and have been accommodated in hotel rooms feel completely safe and supported to talk about their experiences in an open and honest way without reprisal. Any process of inquiry to be co-designed with people who have lived experience of the asylum process in the UK. I've fucking lived experience. Asylum system that allows the abuse of human rights and the inhumane treatment of individuals to stop the abuse and make real changes for the better so that something like this never happens again. People who are asylum seekers in Glasgow must be returned to their residential accommodation immediately. People's basic financial allowance must be restored immediately. The incident in the Park Inn Hotel must be fully and independently investigated at every level of accountability to ensure that lessons are learnt. What lessons? I mean, it's just madness. This never happens again, and the failures of the system are exposed, and justice done the failures of the system, of course. That's what's responsible for yet another stopping in the UK from the guiding principles of the process should be care of those affected regardless of immigration status in the pursuit of the truth. Witnesses of the incident should be protected, yada yada. Our message to our fellow Glaswegians: you have made this city home for us. We make Glasgow together. We fight for changes so that all humans are treated with dignity. Oh, here we go. The truth is heard about the system failures and justice is served. We will not let you down. All the workers, police officers and residents, etc. You do not deserve to go through this. We will be persistent to demand that you all have the support you need. The Scottish Government, you have been progressive and positive attitudes towards us, and we welcome your support. You have seen how the UK immigration and asylum policy results in gross human rights abuses in our cities. We ask you not to tolerate this anymore. Of course, parroting the fake narrative of the hostile environments. You know, the same hostile environment that currently is letting in record levels of migrants from Cali. The same hostile environment that lets in record level annually non-EU immigration to this country. For a country that's so racist, it's rather remarkable that we have record levels of non-EU immigration entering year on year. We're so racist, in fact, that we're planning to end freedom of movement specifically to the European Union, cutting the flow of white migrants to the country to make way for Africans. We're so fucking racist. The hostile environment, it doesn't exist, but it's perfect fitting for the narrative that Thin Lips loves to parrot so she can play the guru, the god, with her rainbow sprinkles and the Tories are bad and everything they say and do is bad, but everything she does is on point and progressive and inclusive and diverse because it's a strength, etc. There is no hostile environment. Pandering does not make you any better than anybody else. We ask you not to tolerate this anymore. Of course, you don't need to ask Sturgeon twice. We know that asylum and immigration policy is a reserved matter, but this is no longer a good enough excuse. What? If it's not a devolved issue for the SNP to handle themselves in particular, then quite frankly, to put it bluntly, that is the end of the matter. That is the end of the discussion. I mean, I don't know what else to tell you. We ask you to use all your powers to prevent human rights abuses in Scotland. And of course, define human rights, because as far as I can tell, it's just more and more encroachment of the United Nations specific laws that they conjured up themselves in relation to human rights. The same people, of course, that are responsible for the migration to this country as well as Europe. The same people that are responsible for all the refugees as well, if you want to go down that route with their safe and legal routes. They've got a hand in creating the migrant crisis to begin with, or the refugee crisis, as it was formerly known as. But people don't want to talk about it, of course not, because it's a crisis, yeah. Ask you to ensure that new Scots who seek asylum enjoy the same rights and entitlements as every other person in Scotland. There's so much wrong with that fucking one sentence. So anybody from anywhere in the world that comes here and rightly or wrongly applies for asylum is by default a new Scot who is fleeing persecution and is traumatised and probably has depression. You have deliberately put people who seek asylum in adverse and inhumane conditions to make their lives as difficult as possible in the UK. You even have a formal name for this policy, the hostile environment that doesn't really exist anymore. You have put in place a system that allows gross human rights abuses. As we have seen, the consequences of this unjust system is ultimately faced by our cities and our communities and our citizens. This has to stop now, and what do you suggest? Ending deportation, making it easier for these people to apply for asylum, rightfully or wrongfully, putting them back into accommodation despite the fact half of them are failed asylum seekers and shouldn't be entitled to any accommodation. We demand accountability for the deaths and irreparable harm to the lives of people who seek asylum, refugees, our fellow Glaswegians as a consequence of your decisions and your failures to act to protect the lives of those in your care. They're in a fucking hotel. We will push for a full and fair examination by way of an independent inquiry, independent my arse, or the scrutiny of a court of your failings. Members who have an outstanding asylum claim wish to remain anonymous in order to reduce the risk of negative impact on their asylum case with the Home Office. Even if they do reject it, you can just apply again. That seems to be what you're all good for at this point. But you know, I've noticed a trend to keep referring to them all as asylum seekers, but just bear in mind the definition of what they would be considered if they had their claim accepted is an asylee. So again, it kind of echoes the point that a lot of them shouldn't be here in the first place. They're failed asylum seekers that continuously keep reapplying, and also quote-unquote asylum seekers that have not had their claim to date accepted.